What's up, guys? It's Johnny Candido of Candido Training
HQ.
Today I want to talk about how to fix the good morning squat or just leaning too far forward in the squat. But also I want to cover a little bit more in depth than that, because you'll see, hundreds of videos already out there basically just saying do more front squats and that's it. But what I want to cover is not just the solution, but also some of the aspects to whether it's actually a problem in the first place. Because in my opinion, that's the more intricate part, and that's also where a lot of people tend to have issues. Because I personally talk to a lot of different people about technique, and a lot of times there's more of an issue in perceiving their own form breakdown than there is in actually addressing it. The first point is the fact that a lot of this is entirely dependent on individual structure and bar position. So what I mean by this is that if you do have a low bar position and you have a lifter who has longer femurs relative to their torso length, they simply are going to have to squat with a good amount of forward lean to keep the bar aligned over the middle of their foot, assuming that they do have a reasonable amount of knee travel and a reasonable squat stance width. So I'll also include a link in the description to a video that just shows a clear model demonstrating this for those who maybe aren't so familiar with this fact. Okay, so that you simply cannot control, obviously, and that's just something you have to deal with and have to accept. The second issue I want to talk about is bar path. Now obviously, ideally, we have a vertical bar path completely and there's no deviations from this. However, what we need to do is we also need to look at how we're going to analyze this. Is that I've seen some people who bring it up to me as an issue when in reality their camera angle is actually not completely to the direct side of their squat and it may be slightly behind them. And if this is the case, if it's just even slightly behind you and it looks almost directly to the side but not quite, then that will actually greatly distort how your bar path appears, because then it'll look like in the bottom position like the bar is over your toes more rather than the middle of your foot.
Oh my. Oh my. Oh my. Hold up. Oh my. You are now listening to Run the Jewels.
So if that's the case, then obviously it may not even be an issue. However, if we do have a direct side angle and we do see that the bar moves forward, then what we also need to look at is the bar moving forward to the middle of our foot and then going up normally, or is it moving from the middle of our foot to over our toes? So if it is the latter, if it is moving over the toes, then obviously that is just a clear skill issue and that needs to be corrected. And I'll include a link in the description to a little drill I have to help with that. But that also just comes down to years and years of training the squat itself. However, if it was the former, where the bar is shifting forward but it's still lined over the middle of your feet, then what it probably is that it's the low bar position you have it in, and then you're probably just forcing being too vertical after unracking the weight before you even begin the descent. So if this is the case, then the solution is simply just to lean more forward before you even begin the squat. That solves the whole issue, because then you're just moving the bar to be aligned over the middle of your foot in the first place, and then you could just squat straight up and down from there. Also, a tip for if you don't have that great of a camera angle and you want to see if you can tell if your bar path is completely vertical is to look at the plates when you squat. Now with most plates you'll be able to tell, because you'll notice they spin slightly forward if you are having a bar path that isn't exactly straight up and down. And if it is obviously completely vertical, then the plates shouldn't move at all. So that's just an easy way to tell, regardless of camera angle, assuming the plates can move a little bit on the bar. Okay, so the next thing to look for is knee position from a side view. And what I want you to look at is that knee position and not focus on where your hips are. The reason being is, a lot of people, obviously, they're talking about their hips shooting up and back, but the thing is that makes it a little bit more unclear. Whereas if you look at exactly where your knees are, you can pinpoint and see how it changes during the lift very clearly, and also it doesn't change really depending on your squat depth as much. So what I mean by this is if we look at an Olympic back squat where you're squatting well below parallel, your hips literally have to move backwards even with your knees being exactly in the same position. So that's not a quad weakness at all. That's simply just the mechanics of a very deep, well below parallel squat. On the other end of the spectrum, if you have a mile high squat like a Louis Simmons style box squat that's way above parallel, that's just more of a hip hinge that's just back and forth. So even though they may have different shin angles, they both have the same consistency in terms of their knee position not changing that much, at least, as they come up out of the bottom position. So as I said, what we're looking for is the knees to stay relatively stagnant as you transition out of the hole. And it can, obviously some people will have them just move in a little bit naturally due to the stretch reflex, but we just want to limit that. So if it's moving in dramatically, then we can see that it probably is a quad weakness. So then that's where I would recommend doing things like the front squat as a solution for that, to force the knees to stay forward. However, for some people, I actually wouldn't recommend that because it also connects to a skill issue. See, for some people, it simply may be a smarter decision to focus on just sitting back more in general and having more forward lean already in the bottom position, because that's just where they're stronger at. So if this is the case, then what I recommend is actually still loading your knees initially concurrently with your hips, and sometimes actually emphasizing this more, loading the knees, but then just limiting the knee travel as you enter in the bottom position. Because a lot of people, what happens is they do the opposite, where they sit back a lot and then they release their knees at the very end. So if you're going to do that logically in reverse, then you're going to have a fairly vertical torso in the bottom position, but then your hips are obviously going to kick back and you're going to turn it more into good morning and lose that tightness coming up out of the hole. And that brings me to my objection for some people with the front squat, is they're not skilled enough to be able to separate those two lifts, and then when they go into their competition low bar style squats, that then they end up carrying over some of those habits from the front squat of getting used to having that forward knee travel all the way into the bottom position, where then once again that just makes the problem worse because they're already stronger with a more hip dominant squat. So for people like that who need that movement pattern to be trained to sit back more, what I recommend is they actually work on quad development separately with machine work, and then just do things like bottom half squats or pause squats to focus on controlling out of the bottom position without having their knees shoot backwards, with keeping their quads involved in the lift, albeit to a lesser extent than their original style, because once again, we're shifting to already a more posterior chain dominant style in the first place. Okay, so the last thing I'd look for, if let's say the bar path looks like it's on point, it's over the middle of the foot, and okay, so the last thing to look for, if the bar path is looking good, and then from the side angle the knees appear to be staying forward as they should be, staying stagnant, coming up out of the hole, then what I look for is I ask for a front view so I can see the knee position from there. Because then often what happens is that means their knees are coming in, which then, everything else being equal, will also cause more forward lean. So this is why it is important to not just say you just do front squats and that's it. Because if knees caving in is causing them to be pitched more forward, then what you need to work on is external rotation of the hips and abduction of the hips. So that's an entirely separate set of problems. So that can be solved by either just doing, obviously, abduction exercises, just isolating that motion, or it can be done by using a hip circle or something around your knees to force yourself to push your knees out while you're warming up doing your back squats. Okay, so now that I've laid out all the factors and their solutions, now what I want to get into is actually if this is even a significant issue in the first place. And this really depends on if you're training for general strength or powerlifting competitions. Because if you are just training for general strength, usually I do recommend a more quad dominant style in the first place. Because the thing is, obviously it's going to match up a little bit better with your training program if you already have other pulling movements, other posterior chain dominant lifts in there. So let's say you have snatch grip deadlift, sumo deadlift, conventional deadlift. You have all these exercises which in my opinion are more effective for just hammering the posterior chain, and are a little bit easier to focus on keeping your back and spinal position in place during those lifts throughout the whole range of motion. This combined with the fact that in general, most people have the hardest time recovering from lower back soreness, it just allows you to have more volume and to train more consistently without having any overuse injuries. And it also just makes you a more complete lifter in terms of just building strength all around, which is, in the end of the day, of course, the goal for general strength. So for powerlifters, of course, all that really matters is being able to lift the most weight as you possibly can on the platform. However, you do also need to take into account the possibility of injuries and long-term being able to accumulate enough volume. So that's something that is so individual, I really won't get into those two parts. But what I will talk about in terms of just strictly performance on the platform is that you need to be able to ensure that you have a degree of consistency and control over the bar. So what I mean by this is, let's say you are one of those lifters who has a good amount of knee travel in the bottom position, but then once you get up to 98% or 97%, around that range, that then all of a sudden your knees do come in and then you start shifting to more of a posterior chain dominant style, that's going to give you issues, because then your warm-ups are just dramatically different than your actual third attempt, which is, in the end of the day, all that counts. So that's where you see the most technically proficient lifters are simply doing the same exact movement when they're using an empty bar versus when they're using a true 1-rep max. Alright, that's it guys. Hopefully this video made it clear that we're dealing with specific factors that determine your back positioning, and we're not just trying to force a perfectly upright torso because that sounds pretty on paper. We're looking at what makes sense for each individual lifter and for their specific goals. And that's it guys. Make sure to like the video, support the channel, subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks for watching guys. Peace!
Been a better bad guy than I've been better than bad. Been a bit of bully talk beating on my chest and fat guy. Half stack from a rat. I've been around the block, babe, I know a few facts. Maniac, radiac, run, go, tell him that. AT, alien, and my ton of that.
Never be wrong, I'm savage. Show up in your class, what's happening? 2-yard bullet with a fully automatic.
Man, fuck a shooting star. Biggie died, they shot a star. Who you know in West LA? Bring that ruckus to MA. Jeez.
And you shouldn't just squat in a way that just looks pretty to you on paper. Is that it should be what's the most functional, not functional, fuck.